It's about pre-crime. It's about predicting stuff before it happens. And that's what I think a lot of people miss about Palantir. A lot of people say about mass surveillance, well, I have nothing to hide. But it's not about if you're doing something wrong now or not. It's about an algorithm thinking if you will do something wrong in the future.
Whitney Webb lays out how the Epstein scandal is just a window into a larger reality. Intelligence agencies, organized crime, and big business have merged into a global power structure that protects its own. She explains how this meta-cartel manipulates countries, orchestrates cover-ups, and keeps the real evidence, financial crimes, arms deals, and blackmail, hidden from the public. The system shields the same names and institutions again and again, feeding us only scraps and distractions while the true networks operate with impunity. If you want to understand what's really driving these scandals, keep watching. And if you find this valuable, make sure to like, subscribe, or follow for more.
I would argue that neoconservatives have very successfully rebranded, and I think Peter Thiel is a very important example of that. As an example, Palantir has been in the news, right? He's a co-founder of that. So how was Palantir created? Well, there was this government program after 9/11 called Total Information Awareness. It was housed within the Pentagon's DARPA office. The man they chose to put in charge of that was John Poindexter, who was the highest ranking member of the Reagan administration to be indicted for his role in Iran-Contra, which again, the continuity of government stuff is relevant here. So eventually, it launches and whatever, but people are outraged by it because, as they rightly pointed out, it would eliminate constitutional protections of Americans' rights, specifically the right to privacy, among other things. It was a huge surveillance dragnet, and its goal wasn't just to, surveil everything. It was to predict crime before it happens, predict terror attacks before it happens. I mean, it's like Minority Report.
Yeah. I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks.
And so after all the pushback, they changed the name to Terrorist Information Awareness and try and rebrand it. We are still going to surveil innocent Americans, but we're focusing on the terrorists. They did all this stuff to try and rebrand it, but Congress defunded it. But hidden in that bill, Congress allowed aspects of it to continue. And essentially, I argue in my work on Palantir that an effort was made to privatize large aspects of TIA as Palantir. When Alex Karp and Peter Thiel were setting it up, they went to John Poindexter through this guy named Richard Pearl, who is a long-standing neocon actor with very extensive ties also to the state of Israel. He was caught in the 70s giving classified information to Israel's embassy and should have gone to jail and somehow did not, and had a lot of ties also to Netanyahu's first government. Richard Pearl is the guy that connected Thiel Karp to Poindexter, and they basically wanted to talk to Poindexter because they wanted to recreate Total Information Awareness and saw him as the godfather of modern mass surveillance. And in doing so, they basically, Peter Thiel teams up with In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital firm. Alex Karp has said on record that the intended clients of Palantir from the beginning was the CIA. And, the CIA was their first client for their first 6 years as a company. Their top developers went to Langley, Virginia, which is CIA headquarters, every 2 weeks to show the CIA their product and have them tweak it to their liking. And during that period of time, one of the top people at the CIA that would have been involved in that is this guy named Alan Wade, who was also intimately involved with Total Information Awareness. And if you look at how Total Information Awareness was described, its privacy protections, it's exactly the same as the way Palantir sold their stuff later on. So there's an insane amount of overlap. And what's crazy here is that Alan Wade, a few years prior, had created a Homeland Security software program that was also pre-crime-esque and similar to what Palantir ended up doing. It was called Kiliad, and he teamed up with Christine Maxwell to do that. It's about pre-crime. It's about predicting stuff before it happens. And that's what I think a lot of people miss about Palantir, because a lot of people say about mass surveillance, well, I have nothing to hide, but it's not about if you're doing something wrong now or not. It's about an algorithm thinking if you will do something wrong in the future. The problem is that pre-crime has been inching along, and actually a lot of people in Epstein world, obviously Peter Thiel and Epstein had a relationship. More came out about this earlier this year after, Thiel kind of tried to minimize his ties a few months earlier. But Peter Thiel's Founders Fund co-invested in this company with Epstein and Wexner and Ehud Barak called Carbyne that basically had a pre-crime component to it. And Carbyne has now colonized an insane amount of 911 emergency call services systems like throughout the U.S. and are the main company at the forefront. If this legislation in the U.S. is passed, it's called Next Generation or NG 911, where they're going to basically federalize and centralize all 911 emergency call systems. And then when you centralize it, you can just put one company in charge. They've changed the board a lot since the Epstein scandal because Ehud Barak was the chair and there were people on the board that were tied to Epstein, including a woman that he allegedly took to the UK to sort of soften up some US senators whose identity is still unknown before the Iraq war vote. But it's a story for another time. And, you know, some other figures tied to Epstein were on the board, and it would formerly been created by veterans of Israeli intelligence. But now they only have one of the Israeli intelligence co-founders on the board. The others have left to do other things. One of them now works for Eric Prince, I believe. And, you know, they've kind of gone their separate ways, and they've tried to rebrand as a more American looking company, I guess. I think they added Trump's former head of DHS, Christy Nielsen, I think is her name, to the board. And they have Michael Chertoff, one of the early heads of DHS under Bush. I think not everything has always been like that. I think this particular group, once they got their hands on power, it's a faction, you know, they've been consolidating control for a long time. And I think the advent of technology, big tech sort of taking over our lives, has really facilitated that. Because the whole conclusion to my book is that why would you take someone like Epstein down? You don't need people like him anymore to compromise people, because all of our lives are increasingly online. So if they want something on you, they can just harvest it off through, you know, whether it's, you know, Palantir, you know, it ends up in your Palantir database. Basically, it's sucked up by the NSA or GCHQ or any of these other agencies. Or if there isn't incriminating stuff, they can plant incriminating stuff on your devices. If they want to screw you, I mean, sure. Yeah. And so it's much easier to consolidate power under those circumstances. How did a guy like Dennis Hastert become Speaker of the House of the United States when it was known that he was a pedophile years before getting to that position? Because they can hold it over his head the whole time.
Webb exposes how governments and corporations coordinate to protect a closed network of elites. She shows how scandals are contained, evidence is sealed, and political theater is used to distract us from the real crimes. Sex trafficking is just one layer. Underneath are decades of financial corruption, arms trafficking, and intelligence operations that connect the same powerful actors. The result is a cycle of impunity where criminal networks rebrand, reset, and continue their influence, leaving the public with only surface-level answers.
My whole book is about how Epstein was not an anomaly. You know, I mentioned the example of Adnan Khashoggi, but I mentioned Robert Keith Gray, who Robert Maxwell hired when he came, you know, to the U.S. and made his big entry into New York City. He was also involved in sex blackmail stuff. There was a page boy scandal he was related to in the 1980s. I think Larry Craig was the name of the main congressman or senator involved. And Craig denied all the charges, but then got caught in the early 2000s for soliciting, you know, sex in a bathroom in an airport or something like that. But yeah, there's been a ton of these scandals over the years. And then you have figures like Roy Cohn, who I mentioned earlier, involved in sex blackmail activities as well. There's a lot of these figures. This is one of those things that's a holdover from the mob that later gets absorbed by intelligence agencies because they see its utility. Knowing information, the sexual blackmail information, the CIA, that's the intelligence to them. We want to gather intelligence on these people and then use it to our benefit for national security interests. It's, you know, it's obviously other things too. I think it depends on the circumstance, really. I understand that my books are like a lot of information, but the thing is, we're never going to get an affidavit from the CIA being like, yes, we did bad things. Like, we've known they've done bad things in various decades. It's been very documented, and they won't admit to bad things there in almost every one of those cases. So it's like, you're not going to get that about Epstein or about anybody else. But I think he became too exposed, I think, especially after his first arrest. And as he described it, he became radioactive, but he had, you know, before been able to move through all these different circles, you know, with impunity, and was a well-respected guy in these elite circles, right? He was useful to a lot of people, mainly for money things, but also for, you know, other more illegal things from, you know, what we know about the case as it's developed. So I think since then, I don't know, he tried to rebrand as like a tech entrepreneur and all this stuff, but he was allegedly still cultivating important relationships. He was reportedly advising Tesla on how to take Tesla private. He claimed to be advising the Department of Treasury on cryptocurrency and anti-hacking efforts. He was still doing a lot of stuff between those arrests. It's just, the public association was, no longer beneficial for a lot of powerful people.
Whitney Webb makes it clear. What we're allowed to see is only a fraction of the truth. The same families, bankers, politicians, and intelligence figures repeat across decades, always insulated from consequences. As long as these networks control the narrative, justice remains out of reach. Be sure to like, subscribe, or follow, and share this video.